is perfect, reviving the soul. The decrees of the Lord are sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is clear, enlightening the eyes. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. And the ordinance of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Let the words of our mouths and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Now, brothers and sisters of the Holy Faith, our scripture passage today chronicles the beginning birth story of a man who, through his prophecy and his guidance to the people of Israel, transitioned the story of the Israelites from the era of the judges to the era of the kings. This time, though, the beginnings begin with not the ushering in of a great man, but of a humble woman caught up in circumstances of her life that render her low in the eyes of Israel, despite the obvious love her husband has for her. Hannah cannot cure her barrenness, but instead turns to her God who can. And through her turning back towards God for her liberation from her current state, she helps to usher in the boy who, through God, would transition a nation from a period where tribalism was the norm into a unified people under a new monarch, kind of. This, of course, as we know, carried with it serious and everlasting consequences, as despite this optimism of an Israel hungry to be great, the fact the Israelites turned away from God as their sovereign Lord and instead put their faith and trust in a human sovereign Lord, and their inability to find favor in the eyes of the Lord proved to be disastrous, resulting in displacement, infighting, a split kingdom, and ultimately exile into Babylon. And yet some Israelites found favor in the eyes of the Lord and continued to do the Lord's work as each king died and the new one succeeded to the throne. Hannah and her family are the first ones to usher in the new era, where the kings rose, but more importantly, the prophets rose to bear witness to God amidst the people who turned away from God in favor of a powerful human ruler who could make their nation great. And it started in the ordinary life of a lowly woman who could not bear a child in a culture that required it, so that the Israelite people would perpetuate and fulfill God's command in Genesis to be fruitful and multiply. Now God chose her, in addition to also choosing Samuel by extension, to usher in that new age, where the prophets were needed to be that voice for God. And it begins with Hannah, and it also begins with Samuel. Now, our scripture passage from a logistics point of view, a literary point of view, is actually not from the first book of Samuel, but from the actual book of Samuel, since 1 and 2 Samuel were at one time a complete book in the Torah. It takes place, as I mentioned before, during the times of the judges, where God's voice is decidedly absent in that time. According to 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. Now, our central character of our passage centers around Hannah, and her relationship in a polygamous marriage to her husband Elkanah, and her prayer to God to be freed from her biological condition, which has rendered her sterile. Now, Hannah demonstrates a level of faith and patience, sometimes, by tolerating her rival Peninnah, the other wife, because she taunts and jabs at her condition initially. But, as is mentioned in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 7, this taunting and harassment goes on for years, causing Hannah undue distress and pain because of her condition. And then finally in verse 9, she presents herself at the temple of Shiloh, where the priest Eli resides at. Now, Hannah demonstrates her faith to God by placing full faith and her life into the hands of God, in hope that she will be his instrument to use for his glory and sanctification. Now, surprisingly, it is Hannah and not Eli whom God answers. And furthermore, Eli in verse 14 doesn't seem to recognize Hannah's penitence, instead mistaking her silent mouthing of her prayer to be a fit of drunkenness in the house of Israel. Or the house of the Lord. Now, Eli should know better, and he demonstrates a lack of pastoral sensitivity towards Hannah, choosing instead to be confrontational with her rather than comforting, as any priest or pastor should be doing. Now, in a bit of dramatic irony, though, as we read this passage, we know what happens to Eli in the end due to his sons. Now, the fact that God chooses Hannah over Eli, as far as lending that voice, it's very dynamic in the lexicon of God's will. Since it seems that the priest, trained from birth to be a witness for God, no longer has God in his corner, therefore affecting his ability to be priestly to the people. And this translates down into his sons. Part of his sin as well are his two sons, who are also priests, but are not very good. They like to steal from the temple offerings at that point. And God is angry with Eli for not chastising his sons and correcting them. So, as mentioned before, God chooses Hannah to further his will. And he does that at first by liberating her from her condition and allowing her pregnancy by Elkanah to happen. This liberation God bestows upon his children is in keeping with God's preferential option for the poor and the downtrodden. Now, Hannah, from what it seems, is not poor economically, but she definitely counts as being one who is an outcast due to her inability to fulfill God's promise of progeny to his people. Yet God never leaves her and takes an active role in her salvation and liberation from her position in life. Now, the pregnancy example, as interpreted from a theology that, for those who were here yesterday, saw me furiously revising a 12-page paper on the theology I've been studying, it's the dynamic. God's liberation is a dynamic reshaping of Hannah's world into something that finds favor in the eyes of the Lord. Now, one could observe that it is Hannah and many biblical characters like her in the Old and New Testament, up to and including Jesus himself, that demonstrates this theology brought to us from God. Now, the theology I'm talking about, there's a label for it, it's called a liberation theology. It seeks to understand God's will and his purpose through the experience and voices of those in our everyday lives who, for all intents and purposes, are silent to us. And that takes the form of the poor and the oppressed. And like Hannah's silent prayer, the invisible people's silent voices cry out to God for liberation from their lot in life. Liberation theology places a premium on people's context and their experience with God's liberating presence in their lives. Now, whether that experience is centered or finds itself in the Nicaraguan campesinos who suffered terrible exploitation at the hands of the rich down in Nicaragua in the 1980s and 1990s, and even in today, or a little bit more close to home, those we know in Mebane, North Carolina, the poor rural people who suffer under oppressive systems that may seem legal, but at the same time denotes how sinister they are. Or, getting back to our story, to even Hannah herself, who suffers from her biology, and finally prays silently with her mouth, but loudly with her soul for salvation. Now, liberation theology gives voice to the sick, the crippled, and the lame, adding a richness to our own way of interpreting Scripture and opening up to those characters whose stories in the Bible seem more profound. Those invisible characters that we may not place a lot of emphasis on. Now, liberation theology seeks to understand how, quote, these people witness God's dynamic, liberating will in this world, teaching us how to properly witness to God and find favor in the eyes of the Lord. Hannah teaches us as Christians struggling that finding favor in the eyes of the Lord doesn't require much, but it only requires everything. We see after Hannah endured and tried to make sense of her lot in life without letting God direct her, after the years of abuse at the hands of the more fertile Peninnah, and even after the support of her husband Elkanah, whom no doubt loved, supported, but sadly did not chastise Peninnah for her behavior towards her sister-in-law, Hannah turns to God for deliverance and encounters her salvation at the temple of Shiloh. Hannah is more of a lens into which we see God than Eli, the chief priest is, and as mentioned before, it's interesting that Eli cannot recognize Hannah's piety and cry for deliverance. For me, he gets an F for pastoral care. But more importantly, as readers of the scripture passage, we see the work of God not in this priest, who you would think has more clarity to know God due to his training and position. No. God shows his mysteriousness and his presence through his preference for this woman, who for the most part is no use to Israelite society because she cannot procreate. And that preferential positioning toward the poor is powerful for us and the good news. For it shows us in this story that while we must acknowledge the universality of God's love towards all his creations, we look at Hannah as a shining example of how God is always present, especially amidst the downtrodden and those most in his need. We, by our very essence of just being who we are, find favor in the eyes of the Lord, because the Lord finds favor in all of us. It is up to us now, through that favor we found in the Lord, to witness to God's universal love and to embody that positioning towards everybody. And even though Hannah gets a footnote, basically, in the book of Samuel, her countenance toward God and the way God interacts with her is exactly the same witness we see in the man we take our title from, Jesus Christ. But God, for mysterious reasons, comes down to earth and is born into a poor family with no status and born in the auspices of scandal, since Mary and Joseph were not married when Mary got pregnant. And yet we know that the good news manifests in the fact that Jesus was common, and that commonness celebrates all life from common to high. That's the reassurance. And that reassurance from the life of Jesus we also get from Hannah, that because she was faithful and her nature turned to God, she found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And let us hope that through it all, we as followers of Christ have faith in the God of Abraham, Joseph, Isaac, and Hannah, carries us through out of the life we once had and into the life that finds favor in the eyes of the Lord. And so, as we transition and get ready to celebrate Thanksgiving in our own individual homes, let us always remember to give thanks to a God who is unlike any other, and that he finds favor in all of us, even the poorest of us. And that because he would even turn towards us to find that favor, we celebrate his redemptive act in his Son, Jesus Christ, who taught us through his teachings, his life, and his actions, that all of us can find favor in the eyes of the Lord just by being who we are. And that who we are is enough for this overall great